like we've never heard the audio of, the alleged payment of $50,000 to Tom Homan, because you don't need to have a conversation. All you need to say is, here's the audio, and the American people could decide for themselves, but they want to tell us what to think rather than giving us the information for us to decide for ourselves. So, the government has an obligation, as a fiduciary on our behalf, which is what their job is, a fiduciary on our behalf, is they should leave the decisions to us. They should be transparent, and we should judge what's important and not important. So that's for us to judge, not for them to judge on our behalf. We never delegated that discretion to them.
Right. So, now, this is a point that is probably clear to most that watch this show regularly, but what you just said there is such an important general idea that what they're trying to transition us into, more of the Trump administration than I've ever seen. The idea that they are, we were given a mandate, which means we just do what we want, and that's what you guys voted for. It's the other way around entirely, and we know that, right? They should be acting out what the living embodiment of their constituents, which is just not the way I think it's ever been. But to think about that as Americans today, how far away we've gotten from that. I mean, Trump displays that every day, Article 2 and so on.
Yeah, so they can show us. They can show us the If something is easy to prove, human nature generally is, if I'm making a claim and it's easy for me to back up my claim, I want to back up my claim for multiple reasons.
Right.
I want to back up my claim to validate who I am, and I want to back up my claim to prove you're a fucking liar. It's part of my expression, because that's part of the pleasure of proving yourself right, is proving the people who tell you they don't believe you, is proving them wrong in a way that they have to acknowledge them wrong. I mean, that's really victory. That's victory of basically saying, here is the evidence, and the evidence is so clear that you have to acknowledge that you were wrong. Okay.
Right.
So if somebody makes a false allegation about me, okay, and it's one that's easy to prove, okay, I want to prove it. I want to prove it because I want to hear that other person say, I was wrong. I want to show them the evidence, either to have them say they were wrong or to have them disappear from shame and embarrassment. Right. Okay, where everybody in the world knows they're a fucking liar. Okay, so I like outing liars. Okay, so the best way for me to out a liar, okay, is to show evidence. It's not the words that coming out of my mouth. Is to bring the evidence to the table, in evidence that no reasonable person would have any doubt about. So the government has that evidence. The government has the ability easily, to remove any doubt from the circumstances.
What's interesting?
Why aren't they presenting it?
Yeah, that's a great point. And what's interesting about it? Well, I mean, I guess I would argue that we're in this confounding time where we've seen this repeatedly. We've talked about repeatedly on the show, where they will say something like, we'll have the evidence. Literally they'll lose a 0-7 Supreme Court ruling, and Stephen Miller will just claim they won 7-0, and then you can come and give the actual evidence. And what's confounding is that that's, to some people, that still doesn't seem to change their mind. So in a normal sense, I agree with you. That's how that should work. But in a weird way today, they've sort of inverted all of this, like even over the overlapping of the court stuff you talked about, where they just deny it, ignore it. And so you're in the sense of presenting the evidence like we do. Like, if they don't reveal it to us, it almost clouds it even more. Because obviously, if they put it out, would be able to prove that they were lying. But if they just have to state it and people believe them, that goes far enough. But if we prove it to them and they still deny it, I mean, how do you circumvent that? We're in a time where far too many people, I think you do think it's the majority, I think it may be a little bit less than that, blindly follow whatever they're told. I mean, what does evidence mean in a time like that?
Well, one of the people watching today said that everybody knows that the world is full of stupid people. So that's a statement I will not dispute.
Thank you, Katie.
That's a big major part of the problem, is the world is full of a lot of stupid people, much too many stupid people, so I think that's a major problem, because I think you have to. I think these arguments we're presenting are so logical and so obvious, that either people are dumb because they don't want to look and they don't have the cognitive skills to be able to listen and talk, because they're so blinded by their partisan nature that they want to shut their eyes to the truth, or that really, they're significantly mentally impaired. So I don't know. I would think a lot of it is not necessarily, a mental impairment. I think it's more, an emotional derangement that they have too much of their identity tied up into being part of a tribe.
I
And
think
since they
that's
want to
it.
be a member of a tribe, they got to be loyal to that tribe. And if
Mhm.
being loyal to the tribe means lying to to prove their loyalty, that's basically their objective function.
It's team sport politics, I mean, look, I've seen it's few and far between in my experience, but I've seen very intelligent people fall into that trap. People that I don't argue are dishonest, because I would argue a very dishonest, intelligent person could probably just choose to do that. But I've seen people that I would not expect fall into it. And I think it's what you just said. It's that their identity's wrapped up in this. And a team sport politics, it's like watching a football game. Nobody really feels it's like dishonest to root for the ref to rule incorrectly in your favor. You know what I mean? Like, they don't think of that as a dishonest thing. And they've just applied it to politics today. It's I don't think it's the majority though, but it's far too many.
Yes.
You-
And also the other comment that's now being made that I also agree with is that too many who believe they're smart because they manage to accumulate wealth.
Yes.
So, I remember, in my case, and I know my personal experience in my case, one day, and even I said one day, I had my risk management model and I sold it for a lot of money. And at 25, I was very, very wealthy. And suddenly, even my mother said, "Oh, Jeffrey, you're such a genius." I said, "You think I'm much smarter today than I was yesterday?" Yes, you're basically now you're reevaluating, you're reappraising me because somebody else put a dollar value on my work.
Mhm.
Suddenly you're reappraising my intelligence, not because of anything you observed on your own, but because just some third party who you don't even know, but they got a name brand out there, and because some name brand was willing to write me a check, and then you made a judgment. Hey, maybe my son is not so stupid. So somebody was giving him all this money. Maybe I should be proud of this guy. Because somebody was being able to write the check, and then suddenly people think you're an expert in everything now because somebody wrote you a check. No, I had one idea. I did a good job of executing it, and somebody valued that one idea. Did that make me an expert on everything? No, it didn't make me an expert on anything. It made me an expert on just one thing, and that was it. So then I have to keep proving myself. So, but yeah, because now you sit back and you hear some people, and we want to hear their opinion on everything. Like somehow they have this extra wisdom because they knew how to make money in something, that somehow they have this wisdom on everything, and only stupid or vain people think that they have wisdom on every topic, under the sun.
And,
No,
and the worst.
people should know what they, I always remembered from the Dirty Harry, at the end of the movie, Clint Eastwood says to the guy, "A man's got to know his limitations." I mean,
Mhm.
so that's really great advice. Okay, is that everybody should be very well aware of what they're good at and what they're bad at.
Oh yeah.
So
And what's
I'm certainly aware of what I'm bad at.
What's worse is the people, like, clearly you made that and were benefiting because of what your work was, right? But there's plenty of people out there. I would even argue like an Elon Musk who, it's not, they didn't develop into it. There was wealth there beforehand. So it's like, it's almost even worse to argue that they're special because of wealth that they kind of already had, even just because they added to it. It's just, that's everywhere today. There's so many of these oligarchs out there that it's just generational wealth. And they argue that gives them some kind of, standing in the society, which is unfortunate. It's the value of money to people's minds.
And then also fame. If you become famous, now all of a sudden people want to hear what you have to say because they want to hear from somebody who's famous and somebody who's not so famous.
Right.
So, if you listen to, these talking heads on just about any program on mainstream media, and compare that to the, the wisdom of like our colleague Bruce, okay, there's no comparison when it comes to the type of topics they're talking about, that Bruce is significantly more prepared than the talking heads you see on TV. So the other day somebody sent me a message. I think it was just yesterday. I think about somebody did a tweet criticizing the people promoting Bitcoin. So, and criticizing Bitcoin because of the people promoting Bitcoin. So he asked me what I thought of this tweet. So I wrote back to him. I said, okay, you know what? I'll tell you what I think of this tweet. The people promoting it are in a business of trying to make money off of Bitcoin. Okay. But if you take a look at who the whales are, people who bought for themselves, not people who invested in Michael Saylor's fund, or gave money to the other funds, but the people who actually began accumulating way before these funds existed. Okay. And people who've been communicating, you don't see them out there promoting Bitcoin. They keep a low profile. So the real whales as individuals, not the institutions that have gotten a lot of retail money and institutional money to invest it in it as a speculative asset. The real Bitcoiners who bought into the philosophy, who bought into what Bitcoin represents, who have bought it and held it, and taken it off exchanges, they don't talk. So they keep a low profile. So so you're talking to maybe the charlatans, the con artists, the late players who are trying to now take advantage of which is appropriate in capitalist system, that people see an opportunity for making a profit. Attracts people, good and bad people to that activity. Wherever there's money, people will be attracted to follow wherever the money is, and there'll be good people at doing that and bad people doing that. But wherever there is money, people are going to follow it. Bitcoin, it became evident that people, that initially it was the government was kind of against it, so people were reluctant to adopt it. Now the government is not so much against it, so people think I'm not getting in trouble for holding it, and institutions are involved in whatever. So, more people got involved, and a lot more people now are holding it, which is okay. And then they started talking about, well, now people are out marketing for institutions, and stuff like that. But this is all human nature. But the reality is they're not focusing on the fact is that the largest individual holders of Bitcoin, who have been holding it for a long period of time, keep a very low profile. So, but of course you're going to get people who will, who will just like kind of promote themselves under, any circumstances. So, and they don't try and present themselves as any wiser than anybody else. They just quietly hold, and hodl and maybe accumulate more, more Bitcoin. I mean, I'm probably one of the few people out there, who make it, who are, OGs and who have accumulated a reasonable amount of people. But I don't hawk Bitcoin. I don't go out every day encouraging people to buy Bitcoin. Every once in a while, somebody will ask me to do an interview. I'll talk about Bitcoin. But, I'm not out there telling people take over their life savings, invest in Bitcoin. I don't have a business. I'm not selling my own Bitcoins. Okay. I just accumulate. And I don't recommend any other business for people to do, other than I tell people, if you're interested, self-custody. And, if you're interested. So people should decide for themselves what they want to do and not do. And of course, if you come across an expert and you want to ask somebody who likes to think they're an expert, but even a responsible expert, like I consider myself, tell people, I'll tell you what my point of view is, but don't do anything based upon what I say. Do anything because you've done your own due diligence.
Right.
I would never want, I got a pretty high opinion of myself. Okay. So with respect to my investing skills and my intellectual skills, but as high opinion as I have about myself and what I think I'm talented at, I would never want anybody acting on anything because I said so. Okay.
Right.
So I want people acting, I'd like to think that somebody who's smart would say, Jeff's a smart guy, and let me think about his words. But there's a difference between thinking about my words and agreeing with my words, or just following them blindly. That would be the worst thing.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
people should make these decisions for themselves, not because of what some asshole, including me, says. Okay.
That's my favorite quote from Roosevelt in regard to the president point and partisanship. Same kind of point, right? It's just that blind, subservience or blind acceptance or anything like that. It's just ignorance. Even if it turns out to be correct, it's still ignorant, like you're saying, because you just don't know. You should investigate, you should do your due diligence, and you should question and be open to all possibilities. The quote from Roosevelt was just that to blindly support the president, right or wrong, is servile and, what do you say, morally treasonable to the American people. I love throwing that out there today because so many people are like literally calling the word patriotism blind support for Trump. It's pretty sad.
No. And in my opinion, there's only one way to be patriotic, is the fact is that is adherence to the Constitution. Okay,
Yep.
not to the Democratic Party, not to the Republican Party. Okay, not to shutting borders or any other specific policy. It's the Constitution. And if we take a look at probably the our most our intellectual founding generation, you could say that maybe the top two was Jefferson as the greatest intellectual, and Madison, not far behind. And one wrote as a principal author of the Declaration. The others considered the father of the Constitution. And they each believed that they wrote a document that was meant to be subject to a strict construction. So they didn't believe that that it was that people, because and actually I did a post today on behalf of the fine print. I think it might be up now on X. Where I take a quote is that Jefferson said that people viewing the Constitution and constructing it should not construct it from a general specific detailed analysis of the text itself, but the goal of the text. And he said, while the text, sometimes people can play games with the text, at the end of the day, you have to look at the text in the context of what their objective was.
Mm-hmm.
And their objective was for virtuous people to live free with a very, very limited government.
Right.
And what was the document? The document was to what was the utility function? Maximize utility, maximize liberty, maximize freedom, minimize the fact that we'd ever be in a state of tyranny, okay? Mm-hmm. That we'd ever have centralized power, that we'd ever have a big government, okay? And it's just as a fact is we lived, as we've talked about a number of times in the past in the show, for the first up until the year we created the Fed and the income tax and direct election of senators, 1913, prior to that, government was very, very small. We spent about 3.5% of GDP, and now we spend almost 50% of GDP, as the size of government. And then we had very little regulation, and we needed very little that we needed to ask permission from the government to do. And now we need to ask permission of almost everything. Then we had almost no disclosure. Think about it. We had really no disclosure obligations, right? You're not buying an income tax return. So basically the government said, we don't need to know anything about you, okay? You operate in your local jurisdiction. You have a local law enforcement, local laws, and if you break those local laws, you'll be responsible for those local laws. And for the few federal laws, if you break them, you'll be in violation of those federal laws. But basically we didn't have this extensive penal code, that we had today. And we didn't have this society that you require permission. We didn't have a heavily burdened regulatory state. So we seem to do pretty well without all this stuff. We became
better.
We came from 13 colonies that had to deal with continued efforts from Europeans to interfere with our sovereignty, right. And ultimately they acknowledged it, and we expanded to become 50 states, and I guess we were over 40 by the time 1930 came around. I think we've just maybe added 2 states since then. I guess it's just Hawaii and Alaska in the 20th, in the 20th century. But I could be wrong on that. I have to check, but that's best my knowledge. And so we prospered. We came from a small country to one of the wealthiest in the world during a period of time when we had a real state of freedom and very little, even with the destruction of economic value that occurred during a horrible civil war where many people were killed. How quickly we recovered from that, as we adapted because we were relatively free people, and relatively free people left to themselves figure out how to way of solving problems.
Mm-hmm. Right. Self-responsibility is the foundational element of this, This is why I bring up the point, and I'm actually glad we got into that a little more in depth about, if you're going to say shall not be infringed, God given, I still find it impossible that those things can then be altered or changed, you know? And so as a society, we can decide collectively just to go, we don't believe in this anymore. But if we're within the Constitution, and it's been ruled more than once, Mabry versus Madison, I often point to, that, you know, if it's repugnant to the Constitution, it's null and void, which is, we can amend these things. And Bruce gave some good, shine some light on that in regard to more nuance to it.